Developing instructional multimedia. Why how is important. A theoretical basis for principles of multimedia design. In a multimedia learning environment, both words and pictures are used to promote learning. The right mix of these representations is essential if content is to be delivered in a way that is consistent with how people learn best. While fast-moving images and audio messages are engaging and stimulating, they do not necessarily result in meaningful learning. We've all watched something interesting and wished we could remember more of what was presented. This may have been possible if the presentation had been made differently. Cognitive theory of multimedia learning provides coherent, useful research-based guidelines for instructional design. To help you prepare your multimedia content for this course, you may wish to review this presentation throughout the semester. Let's consider 3 assumptions for the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. When we learn with multimedia, we process material in separate channels, an auditory and a visual channel. Some of the material we receive as sound and images is processed into verbal and pictorial models. We call this the dual channel assumption. We next need to understand that the amount of material that can be processed at one time is extremely limited. We refer to this as the limited capacity assumption. As we focus and pay attention to incoming sounds and images, we mentally select some words and images, then organise these words and images into our verbal and pictorial models. We then integrate these words and images with what we already know, our prior knowledge. This process of selecting, organising and integrating is the basis for the active learning assumption. The intended result of this process is meaningful learning that supports problem solving. Meaningful learning is far more likely when multimedia instruction enables all 3 assumptions for both processing channels. Now that we're familiar with the major elements of cognitive theory of multimedia learning, we want to look more closely to consider how we present words and pictures. We replace the words auditory and visual in the model so that words and pictures are represented in each of the processing channels. Because words can also be presented as text, we'll need to show a link to the visual processing channel. So words are not only spoken as narration, but can be presented visually as on-screen text. Pictures include a variety of static images, as well as videos and animations. We find all of these elements in multimedia presentations. These representations make their way into our sensory memory, are processed in our working memory, and ultimately reside in our long-term memory. It's important to remember that working memory is extremely limited. This means that 1 sentence of text or 10 seconds of video may be all that can be held for processing at one time. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is almost unlimited. Consistent with the active processing assumption, when you select and organise words and images and integrate them, the demands on working memory can reach a point where cognitive overload is experienced. This occurs because the processing demands evoked by the learning task exceed your processing capacity. When you're developing multimedia material, it is essential that you be sensitive to your learner's capacity for cognitive processing in these areas and reduce the chances of cognitive overload. Making sense of new material is where most cognitive overload is experienced. It involves these 5 essential processes of active learning. There are other sources of cognitive load: incidental processing and representational holdings. So how can we effectively design multimedia to make learning easier? Let's briefly consider some aspects of this presentation to do this. In this presentation we've used images and narration because research shows that deeper learning occurs with words and pictures than with words alone. We've narrated rather than have you read on-screen text because reading while watching animation overloads visual processing capacity. If you're watching an animation and reading the text that's appearing on the screen now, you would experience overload on the visual channel. Corresponding words and images have been placed together in this presentation so that scanning is reduced and selection and organisation is easier. Visual highlights have also been added, as has verbal emphasis. This is to aid in selecting the important material. We've also tried to provide concise information and omit any unnecessary material, even if we thought it was interesting. Simultaneous presentation of words and images hopefully reduced the need to hold representations in memory. We have, however, been unable to provide you with navigation controls to allow a paced delivery or for you to view segments and manage cognitive load that suits you personally. We've also not given any pre-training or preliminary instructions which may have provided advanced organisers and freed up essential processing and working memory. But here's some pre-training for next time. On this screen are some of the principles we've applied, and they'll be explored further in our next presentation. Feel free to explore them from items in your reading list so that when they're applied you'll be more familiar with the terms. Thank you.